Hey, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Street, our podcast on the intersection of commercial real estate and the world we live in. I'm your host, Therese Fitzgerald. Is nuclear energy the answer to the ever-increasing demand for power in the United States? The current administration thinks it is, and they're investing billions into speeding up its return. And so are Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. From a sustainability perspective, nuclear energy has undeniable benefits for commercial real estate, decarbonization, and reliability. But there are downsides as well, and that's resulted in a patchwork regulatory environment. To discuss this complex topic, I'm lucky to have as my guest Jon Lemmond. He is growth leader for sustainability operations, smart building services, and energy engineering for real estate management services at JLL. Lemmond brings 20 years experience across energy engineering, policy, and facilities operations to helping his clients strategize on their energy, sustainability, and decarbonization goals. I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. Hi, Jon. Thanks for coming on the podcast to talk about what seems to be a resurgence of nuclear energy and its potential for real estate users.
Therese, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about nuclear.
Okay. Before we dive into the topic, let's talk about your sustainability journey and the journey to your current role at JLL.
Yeah, happy to. Out of mechanical engineering school, I started working with the Navy, with the Naval Facilities Engineering Command, specifically on buildings. It was not a sustainability job. I did mechanical engineering, construction, design, project finance, and I learned I specifically didn't want to work in HVAC. I didn't want to do HVAC work, and that's what I thought. And then in graduate school at UC Berkeley, that's where I made a deliberate decision to dedicate my career to decarbonization. I
Okay.
studied civil and environmental engineering, and I came out of that focused on energy efficiency in buildings and decided clearly I will work in HVAC. That's where I kind of started. And my first role from there was with the Air Conditioning, Heating, Refrigeration Institute. I wanted to learn about HVAC equipment in detail. And they hired a lot of engineers there. It's a nonprofit trade association representing manufacturers of HVAC equipment. They hired a lot of engineers to manage their certification program. So all the air conditioning units in backyards across America, there's a label that says AHRI and that says how efficient it is or it's not. And so they hired engineers to run those certification programs. And it was in DC, so we got to learn, there was an advocacy component to that job as well at the US Department of Energy for their rulemakings on energy efficiency. So it was a great education in large scale energy efficiency. I missed being in buildings and I wanted to get more tactical in field experience. So then I worked for 5 years with a German American energy efficiency engineering consultant, Bauman Consulting.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of time in buildings over those years doing energy audits, retro commissioning, condition assessments. And one of my clients back then was JLL. So I moved to New York with knocking on the door of JLL to sell consulting services. And my contact at JLL said, "Hey, you're one guy for this company in New York. You don't know anybody. But if you want to save more energy, join JLL as an energy manager." So that's where I made the jump and got to save a lot of energy in those first couple of years, dedicated on a large tech account, saving energy. And from there, my career has moved progressively up the scale of the problem, from individual buildings to portfolios to the grid level questions that we're going to be talking about today. Really what's changed dramatically over those years is where energy sits in the conversation. It used to be a background consideration in real estate decisions, and today it is the primary constraint, especially for data centers and heavy industrial users. So that shift is what makes nuclear so relevant to my job right now.
Yeah. So you must be very busy right now because energy is on the top of the priority list or the problem list today.
Yeah, it seems there's a lot of work to do. We're staying busy.
Okay, so let's talk about nuclear energy and how it fits in that landscape. Um, as I'm sure you know, 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Energy announced a $17.5 billion loan program for utilities and private entities for the deployment of 10 large nuclear reactors. Um, when and if the program's objectives are reached, how would that change the energy outlook for real estate projects and the real estate outlook generally in the United States?
If that goal is reached to build 10 large Westinghouse reactors, it's going to change things. But first, I'll put it in context a little bit. This program, it's a loan, so it's not a grant. It's specifically a loan, and what it will do is de-risk capital for utilities and private developers who want to build or restart large reactors. So far, as far as I've seen, I've checked this morning, no developers or utilities have publicly announced their participation in this program. So it's quite a timeline. And so if the program succeeds and these 10 reactors come online, the direct implication for real estate is, to put it broad brush, it's more carbon-free baseload capacity on the grid, specifically in markets where those reactors will be sited. So in PJM, which is PJM territory in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest grid, it would likely be the most immediate beneficiary. That's where a lot of data centers are built. And for real estate decision making, the more baseload nuclear you have on a grid, the more confidence a developer or tenant can have in both the reliability and the carbon profile of the grid power. And that tenant doesn't have to negotiate their own dedicated power supply deal. And right now, some of the hyperscalers are essentially doing the DOE's job themselves by funding nuclear restarts and new SMRs bilaterally, because the grid alone can't deliver what they need to add data centers and to site new industrials. So more federal investment in large reactors changes that calculus over time. And I think the honest caveat for the audience is that, I alluded to this before, even with this program, large new nuclear plants are a long lead time projects and proposition. The most recently built nuclear power plants in America, the Vogtle units 3 and 4 in Georgia, they're the last ones to come on in recent memory. It came in years late and roughly double the original budget estimates. So the value of this program will depend heavily on execution, contracting discipline, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC's processing speed. So, for real estate specifically, watch which markets these reactors are sited in. Nuclear proximity is already a site selection differentiator. And so, more reactors mean more power geographies that become attractive for data centers and heavy industry.
Right. Yeah. And some grids, I guess, in some states would be more apt or more capable of moving quickly on these, would you
Yeah.
say?
And some states, I think it's 8 states, including California, have a moratorium on no new nuclear. And other states have, including New York, has severe restrictions on building new nuclear power plants.
So it could be very consequential, but not easy and not quick.
Yeah.
How about cost? What does that do for the cost to a real estate user being near one of these reactors?
Yeah, I think more than cost right now, it's siting capability. I mean, the most coveted real estate in America right now isn't a location, it's a megawatt with a delivery date. Um, it is the largest obstacle to building new uh, data centers and industrials, and it's power. Um, Power's gone from the last box you check to the first question you ask when you're looking for a new site. And the cost, part of the cost of nuclear is really the incredibly long and regulatory process through the NRC and through the approval process. And it's extraordinarily expensive. And, there's a lot of steps and a lot of people involved. And the supply chains just aren't built out yet because we haven't been building nuclear in a long time.
Right.
So some of these federal initiatives should um, streamline the regulatory process and reduce overall costs. And the more expensive the nuclear power plant, the more that cost has to be passed on to ratepayers and to our energy costs. So if we can build nuclear in a cost efficient way once it's built, that's a huge amount of base load that should then impact, help us site more, build more, and then also help minimize the cost increases from energy usage.
You talked about we haven't been building nuclear for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of nuclear energy, how it kind of went from, the power source of the future in the 60s and 70s to something that was feared and scrutinized to its revival today?
I think it's a fascinating history, and the arc of that history is quite dramatic. It really is. I mean, in the 1950s, nuclear was a national optimism project. Dwight Eisenhower gave a speech, Atoms for Peace, in 1953,
Hmm.
that deterred use of nuclear armament and nuclear weapons, and kind of helped springboard the use of nuclear for peaceful energy production. That and other factors in the 1960s, as the technology became scalable, there became a massive amount of orders through utilities, and it was genuinely seen as too cheap to meter. It was considered the cheapest form of electricity.
Wow.
But the economics started to crack before the accidents, and by the mid 1970s, the construction costs started soaring. That there were high interest rates and slower than expected electricity demand growth, where those started causing cancellations.
Mm.
And that's an important point. The public narrative now, if you think about it, seems to blame the accidents that happened a little later, but the economics were wobbling first. So if the economics were wobbling in the 1970s, 3 Mile Island happened in 1979, which was
Right.
a partial meltdown with a small radioactive release. It was terrifying. There were no documented public health fatalities, but it became part of the fabric of American consciousness, and something to be feared. And then 7 years later, Chernobyl, where there were significant fatalities, and it was a genuine catastrophe. And after that, the industry spent, really the next 3 decades in a near complete construction freeze. No new U.S. plants were authorized to begin construction between 1978 and 2012.
Mm.
So that's over 30 years. So really, well, Fukushima reinforced the stigma in 2011, and Germany completely phased out its nuclear program. And so, fast forward to present day or this decade and what changed. There's really three forces in this decade that have caused a shift. And that's the urgency of decarbonization,
Hmm.
the AI and computing driven explosion in electricity demand, and now, as of very recently, federal policy support. So, nuclear's defining characteristic of round the clock carbon free power went from a niche feature to a critical need.
Right.
And, the last thing I'll say about the history is the symbolism of some recent news at 3 Mile Island, the site of America's worst nuclear accident. It's being restarted, not the plant that failed, but the one that continued to power right next to it at 3 Mile Island. It's being restarted to power Microsoft's data centers, and construction is
Wow.
ahead of schedule, targeting 2027. So you couldn't really plan a more vivid symbol of the turnaround.
Yeah. Full circle, so to speak. Yeah, I was reading on a Department of Energy fact sheet. It said around 20% of our electricity is now um, sourced from nuclear energy. So that's something I didn't know. Um, yeah, how do you think that kind of regulatory patchwork is going to work out? Do you think states that highly regulate it will probably not do it, or
Yeah, there's probably not right away. I mean, there's a tension, it seems, between the federal momentum and the regulatory patchwork. The White House signed 4 executive orders last year directing the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to streamline licensing and create an 18-month deadline for new reactor decisions, as well as do some other things. And, the Department of Energy is backing multiple SMR programs with loans and grants, in addition to the loan program we discussed earlier. And, just July 1st, last week, their NRC issued, in response to some of those executive orders from last year, a proposed rule that is called Modernizing Reactor Licensing, Safety, Oversight, and Siting Practices. What it does is it keeps limits on the levels of maximum radiation that workers
okay.
and the public can be exposed to, but it removes a principle in our rulemaking that keeps the low level radiation, quote, as low as reasonably achievable. So they're removing that language. And what that does, the requirement now when NRC is reviewing a proposed project, they say, oh, you have to keep the low level radiation as low as reasonably achievable. So they build very expensive mitigation technologies to keep the low level radiation lower than, we have the data to know whether or not it actually has a health benefit or not. Because remember, there's low level radiation everywhere.
Hmm.
So there's no measurable health benefit to some of these very expensive mitigation practices for that low level radiation. So, we mentioned the moratorium or restrictions for a couple of states, and that's gonna, yeah. Again, I don't see that changing right away, although it's starting to ease up a little bit. A lot of those restrictions, like California has it, Oregon and Massachusetts, and some other states, they were put into place after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. And,
Yeah.
some of that state regulation has loosened in 2025 and 2026, but state restrictions vary widely. Some ban new construction, some restrict waste storage, some require legislative approval before permits can be issued. So for site selection, this creates clear go and no go jurisdictions, and the go markets are getting crowded fast.
Hmm.
Pennsylvania has multiple existing plants, in Tennessee and Wyoming, Texas and Idaho. They're leading destinations for new nuclear activity. California and New York, it's still very difficult, if not, seemingly impossible. There's another regulatory dimension that's genuinely unresolved, and that's FERC's rules on nuclear co-location. So
Okay.
Amazon tried to co-locate a data center campus directly behind the meter at a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, and FERC rejected the expanded power arrangements twice on grid fairness grounds. So they restructured as a traditional front of the meter PPA, and that's a signal to real estate developers. Nuclear adjacent site selection is valuable, and
Yeah.
the legal and regulatory structure of how you take power from a nearby plant matters enormously. So,
Yeah.
my advice for clients navigating this is to treat state and federal regulatory status as a first screen in site selection, not a due diligence afterthought.
Yeah.
And the states moving fastest on nuclear permitting will attract the most investment. So maybe some of these states with bans or severe restrictions will change, but it's very slow moving.
Yeah. When you talk about that co-location, I'm thinking of kind of like the data center backlash and, what does the community think of a nuclear reactor and a data center on the same plot?
It's funny you bring that up. I just read something that Gallup found that Americans are now more comfortable with a nuclear plant next door than a data center.
Really? Wow.
53% oppose a nearby reactor and 71 oppose a nearby data center. So that's
Right.
a stunning, change from the Chernobyl days in the
Yeah,
90s and early aughts.
absolutely. You mentioned the sustainability benefits, um, decarbonization, I guess, being the main one. And I think it's also very dense, right? You don't need as much energy. Some environmentalists, however, do not like nuclear energy. Kind of what are the sustainability downsides of it?
Yeah, there's real benefit and real concern, and both are 100% valid. When when you're trying to determine the environmental impact of any infrastructure project, the best practice industry, we tend to do life cycle assessments. It's a study that quantifies all these different environmental impacts. There's a lot of different kinds of environmental impacts.
Hmm.
Climate change, global warming, carbon emissions is
Right.
one, but there's eutrophication of water, there's public health impacts, there's ozone depletion, there's all kinds of environmental impacts that they try to measure. So everything has trade-offs. For nuclear, there's the benefits are, the biggest one for me is the most immediate problem, which is decarbonization as far as environmental impacts. And
Yeah.
nuclear has near zero operating carbon emissions.
Hmm.
It is a similar life cycle carbon footprint as wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tiny land footprint, and it's has a high capacity factor, meaning it's never down. You can count on it. It's rarely down. Um, you heard, what was it, sometime in the past 10 years, a couple of big firms announced, I think Microsoft and Google, I forget exactly who, but Google had a 24/7 carbon-free goal. They said, at any point, any
Mm-hmm.
second of the year, we're going to create carbon-free electricity at the same time we use it. Well, nuclear is really great for that, for meeting that goal. It's the only source enabling credible 24/7 carbon-free power. It's what a lot of corporates do to meet that kind of goal is to offset their emissions with renewable energy credits, and nuclear
Right.
is stronger than buying RECs for making
Mm-hmm.
the sustainability claim. And of course, let's talk about the concerns, because it has unique and real concerns. Uh, the biggest unresolved one, we talked a little bit about low level radiation, low level nuclear waste. the high level waste is incredibly dangerous, and it lasts for thousands of years. It can be impactful to environments and people. And in a lot of countries, in France and Japan, and I think in Russia, they can reprocess their high level nuclear waste, essentially eliminate it. It has some risks when you do that. There's an opportunity to create weapons grade uranium. And in the US, we do not reprocess our high level nuclear waste. We keep it on site.
Oh.
And so there's for a while, for decades, we were thinking about shoving it down a mountain, Yucca Mountain out in the West. It is the most studied piece of real estate in the history of the world. It's a mountain to put high level nuclear waste, and we never ended up doing it. So that high level nuclear waste is something that really needs to be, for revitalizing the nuclear industry, that's something that we have to address. And it's a valid sustainability concern.
Mm-hmm.
They also use a tremendous amount of water. 3 Mile Island draws over 70 million gallons a day of water. So as our climate rapidly changes and there's wetter wets and drier dries, there's more droughts, it's an issue. It's just a tremendous amount of water use.
And the water is for cooling, or the water is where they get the atoms from?
Well, like these 10 new power plants that the DOE wants to build, these Westinghouse power plants, they use nuclear heat, they heat water to make steam to drive turbines to create electricity.
Okay. And
they also use water for cooling. So it's just a whole lot of water.
Mm-hmm.
And, but from an environmentalist standpoint, the debate has really shifted. When I lived in Berkeley, they were like, no nuclear materials can come through the city. Right. Those were the hardcore environmentalists. And the debate has generally shifted in that the environmental community isn't monolithic. They're not entirely opposed to it. And a lot of environmentalists now back nuclear as necessary for deep decarbonization. It's really being viewed now as, by many, including the environmentalist community, as necessary for us actually decarbonizing our energy grid.
Wow, that's really interesting. You have a lot of energy conversations and you see a lot of strategies. What are some of the other innovations out there that you think have potential other than nuclear?
Well, there's a lot of options. And, I think the way I think about it, and I think if you're zooming out and trying to solve this bigger problem, it's how are we going to build a diversified, lower carbon and resilient power stack of technologies. All these technologies have different pros and cons and capabilities. And so, right now what's happening is, there's a lot of behind the meter natural gas use, gas turbines and Bloom. If you look at the Bloom stock, it's gone up, that they make fuel cells that run on natural gas, and they can be deployed in months, not years. So it's, there's carbon footprint associated with that, of course, but it's fast and reliable. What I like as somebody motivated for decarbonization, as an energy efficiency person, making use of what we already have, that's my background, load shifting using technology, batteries, grid modernization, and demand response is basically using what we already have. I mean, the whole electricity grid in the United States usually just runs at a third of the capacity. We've designed the system for the worst case scenario when all the air conditioners are on and all the plants are humming and all the industries running. We build our power plants to meet that, but we usually are just a third of the capacity. So seeing a lot of solutions out there, and there's a lot of talk about making our grid much smarter, to use energy storage, to shift to use energy to charge batteries when there's low demand, and then deploy batteries when demand is high.
Mm-hmm.
And so by shifting that, and there's a lot of opportunity there. And, where AI is a big energy drain, but I just heard about a technology from a well-funded startup that is using AI to analyze the grid and shift load to take advantage of that. We only need to build for a maximum capacity. So
Yeah.
grid scale batteries, are great, and on-site solar plus storage. The economics have flipped. It's not expensive. It's standard. It's not a premium add-on at this point for those technologies. And another technology that I love and I find fascinating is enhanced geothermal.
Okay.
And so, what's interesting about that, there's a couple of different kinds of ways to use geothermal, to build geothermal for heating and cooling. You don't have to go that deep in the earth. But enhanced geothermal, it varies by where you are in the country, goes very deep to get very hot temperatures where you can tap a lot more energy. Um, there's a company, Fervo, which is powering Google in Nevada. So what's enhanced geothermal does, it gives you nuclear's reliability without the issue of radioactive waste or these big siting fights.
Yeah.
I that's those are kind of the technologies that are come up regularly.
Yeah. You mentioned wind, which has had some starts and stops. What do you think the potential for that is, or is it just a
I think
quagmire?
the potential is high. Especially if you look at in Texas, there's a tremendous amount of onshore wind already. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
the economics are penciling out. The offshore wind has really been a challenge, a financial challenge to build, and the start and stop of federal support has caused some whiplash in the industry too. So a lot of planned offshore wind um, that we thought was going to happen a few years ago isn't going to happen, but it's still very cost beneficial to build wind, and especially when we're adding more batteries. Um, and if we can unlock, the utilization of batteries in vehicles, for example, to do some of that load shifting, that
Yeah.
pairs well with the variable renewable energy sources such as solar and wind. The biggest complaint that you hear about wind is, oh, but what about when the wind's not blowing? Well, batteries can solve that problem.
Yeah. Efficiency is always the bottom line. Um, Jon, this has been fabulous. I always ask my guests what they're listening to or reading or who they're following on this topic or sustainability generally. Can you make some recommendations to my listeners?
Yeah, happy to. I read a lot, and but I like podcasts, but I'm always a music first kind of person.
Okay.
But the podcast I do will not miss is anything that Jigger Shaw makes. He was the former director of the DOE loan program. He had before that role, he was on a podcast called The Energy Gang, and now that
Okay.
podcast is that he leads is called Energy Empire. So I
Okay.
love the way he explains. He speaks in paragraphs and is very articulate and easy for my brain to digest the topics. I've also started getting into the Volts podcast with David Roberts, and that covers the energy transition with depth and not a lot of, it's very little hype.
Mm-hmm.
And his episodes on load growth and grid constraints are directly relevant to what we're discussing. Um, in print, Power Magazine and Utility Dive are that's what's good for tracking what's actually happening in the nuclear and grid space week to week. So yeah, those are the trade publications I rely on.
Okay. So I'll have to check those out. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Therese.
And thank you, listeners, for joining me on Sustainability Street. If you'd like to continue the conversation about this episode, or you have suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to me at therese.fitzgerald@cpe-mhn.com. You can find more CPE podcasts on our website or on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Bye for now.